welcome everybody to Human Monsters. And today we have a special episode because I'm speaking with Steve Fishman, who is the host of an investigative true crime podcast called The Burden. And one thing that we discussed before we arranged this interview was that, a long time ago, I wanted to interview Frank Serpico, who is kind of on the Mount Rushmore of legendary police officers, and that the whole case involving corruption is a very famous one. They made the movie with Al Pacino. And so Steve's podcast involves corruption, though it involves the police, but it also involves people who are accused of crimes. But Steve's the expert on this case, so I'll let him tell the story. But first of all, well, thank you for joining us.
Sure, glad to be here.
And so tell me how this all came about in terms of how it inspired you to create the show and how the information came to you, and why did you find it so compelling that you wanted to involve yourself with it in this way?
Yeah, and involve myself for years, which was not my initial idea. But The Burden, which is the name of the podcast, let's see. Well, let me back up. I was a long-time staff writer for New York Magazine, and as such, I got to do a bunch of the longer features and cover stories, and I ended up covering a bunch of crime. Son of Sam opened up to me in prison. I got snuck into prison one day and sat down with Son of Sam, and then Bernie Madoff called me from prison and confided in me. So I had some background in this, and then I'd done a podcast called Empire on Blood, which actually we're going to re-release. It was #1 on Apple for a while, and that was about a wrongful conviction in the Bronx. And what I thought coming out of that was, I thought I understood a lot about the point of view of the wrongfully convicted person, and a lot less about the point of view of the cop. The cops are always a bit of a black hole. You know what the court says, what the document says, but they very rarely kind of talk frankly. And there was this kind of provocative thing that I thought was in the air about the detective that The Burden focuses on. His name is Detective Louis Scarcella. And one of the things that kind of came out is, listen, this guy was the great detective of the 80s and 90s. I mean, he got the confessions nobody else could get. He had a superhero nickname. They called him the Hulk. He could bench press 400 pounds. He'd have fights with what he called bad guys on the street, car chases through the streets of Brooklyn. I mean, this guy was a terrific character and a man for his times, the 80s and 90s, when New York City was overrun with crime. I mean, imagine 2,500 murders a year. Yeah, it's a big city, but that's like a lot of bodies falling all the time. So in marches a guy like Louis Scarcella, bigger character than life. Got a way getting confessions. He's got a way to arrest the worst criminals. He goes on the Dr. Phil show to boast about his technique. And then fast forward 30 years later, 21 people he helped investigate have had their convictions overturned. So there were clearly two sides to this story. And that's what The Burden takes up. And one of the things that initially got me interested in Scarcella was the fact that he hadn't talked to anybody in a long time. As a result, nobody had heard his story. Nobody had insight into him and what he did or said he did. And two, the news was coming out that he was a rogue official. He was a rogue cop who kind of hoodwinked the whole system. And listen, I'd covered cops and criminals and police for long enough to know, one guy hoodwinking the entire district attorney's office didn't make sense. So I felt there was something there. And then there was this other component to the story, which I happened upon, which is that there are these jailhouse lawyers So these were guys who were, three of them were convicted with Scarcella's help. They meet in prison. They discover they have Scarcella in their case. They form a law firm in prison. So these are all convicted murderers. None of them had graduated high school. And they hit the law books and they discover among themselves certain things that seem suspicious to them about Scarcella. So they start targeting him. So you have these kind of legendary cop on one hand and these jailhouse lawyers on the other. And basically, it's a zero-sum game. One's got to win, one's got to lose. And in the middle is this great character reporter who goes by the nickname Frenchie, like some kind of film noir character. She's a brand new reporter at the New York Times. She gets the tip from the jailhouse lawyers, and she runs with this story and makes it front page news of the New York Times. And what I love about her is that she is fearless. She told me that her thinking about this story was, it might be dangerous. You know, the real killers, if they're wrongfully convicted, then the real killers are still out there. So she was warned that it was dangerous, and her answer was, if I have to die for this story, well, it's a good cause to die for, which is in the podcast. Now, you don't get a lot of reporters kind of sounding like they're acting in a film noir movie, but that's our Frenchie. So we put all these forces in motion. And my first order of business here was Scarcella. Nobody had gotten him to talk. And I figured we had to do that. So I launched a campaign. I called him. He didn't answer. I called people who knew him, put in a word for me, no word. I called reporters who I knew he was friendly with. Nothing came back. And then one day, I actually happened to be in my bedroom at home. And, you know, you get that classic Apple phone ring. And it's Scarcella. And he says, all right, I want to talk, but I don't want to do it over the phone. And he gives me an address to meet him at a Coney Island diner. And for those who are not from New York area, Coney Island, you know, is the famous section of Brooklyn with the classic amusement park, the Wonder Wheel, the Cyclone. And it just so happens that first grade detective Louis Scarcella, at the same time that he was a first grade detective, was working one of the booths.
What?
At Coney Island.
Wow.
One of my favorite movies is The Warriors, and I was thinking of the Ferris wheel, the Wonder Wheel, and this former detective's working at that carnival setup amusement park.
Oh yeah, so he's the come on in, come on over, every round of winner, you got to be in it to win it, and so he's spieling there, and you know, kind of mentions how you fix games at the place too, which. You're going to have to listen to the podcast to hear more about. But we meet at this diner, and in walks Louis Scarcella, who, you know, at that time, I think was 64 years old. He'd been retired since 2000. He's in great shape, a little shorter than I thought he'd be, maybe 5'9". And he's got on a sleeveless T-shirt, so you can see his up and down both arms are tattoos. He's got the Wonder Wheel tattooed on it. He's got his father was a detective. He's got his father's badge tattooed on another arm. So, you know, this guy's the real deal. And walks in. He still doesn't want to talk. You know, he talks and talks and talks. He says, but, you know, I'm not going to do a podcast with you. So he says, he gets up, he says, let's meet again. And let's talk. And so that's how it begins, that he basically gives me a test, kind of a test of, I don't know, persistence or loyalty or something. So the first thing is, I got to meet him at a Russian bathhouse, you know, on the edge of the water.
Wow.
So he and I are in the sauna together. Now, I hate saunas. I just think they're too hot. Are you allowed to curse on this show? Probably not, right?
No. I was thinking at first, like, just outside the bathhouse and then go somewhere else and think, wow, he actually brought you in there. Well, he was probably testing you again by making you sit there naked, I guess. So.
Well, yeah, I mean, we were in bathing suits, but, you know, at one point he gets the oak leaves and you know, has me lie down in the sauna and starts beating me with oak leaves. And I don't know, maybe that would be a metaphor for the nature of our relationship. But he, you know, he was a big health nut and was convinced that all this stuff was great for your health. And then another test was, listen, this guy was also president of the Polar Bear Club, which is, you know, a club on Coney Island, which famously swims in the Atlantic Ocean on New Year's Day. And so he had me plunge into the freezing Atlantic as well, you know, as like plunge and out, because, you know, it takes your breath away. And by the way, I hate cold water. But finally, he says, I say to him, have I passed the test? And he said, pass the test. And he's in the studio and he sits down, and now he's been busting to tell his story. He's like with us for 35 hours. And there's a guy who hasn't talked in a decade. So that's how we're off. And then, you know, I promised him that I would tell his story. You know, now I did this with a co-host, an African-American man. I mean, justice stories in America and especially in New York tend to be stories that are have a strong racial component. So Dax and I had kind of, we went into this story through different doors. Dax had been wrongly arrested by a bunch of cops in Washington, D.C. The trick there, the twist there is that they were black cops. But my experience was slightly different in that I owned a bar in Brooklyn on kind of a really OG block. And it was pretty violent. And I needed the cops. You know, there was a guy running down the street shooting at somebody. There was a knife fight. There was a guy with a bat. I mean, on and on. And actually, I brought Scarcella to the bar one day, and it turned out Scarcella had patrolled the street, the dead-end street that the block was on. I mean, that the bar was on. This bar is called Herbs, after my father. And Scarcella it was late afternoon. Scarcella looked around the block and he said, you know, there was guys playing dice, there were guys drinking, you know, there were some drugs that were being sold. And he looked around, he said, oh, man, I don't see anything good here. This is like atomic energy. Anything could happen. And you know what? A year later, there was a murder at my bar. So two things from that story. One is that I was open to the idea that the police and what they do and the order they can keep is necessary, especially for a guy like me trying to run a business. And I also had some sense that what a cop like Scarcella might apprehend in a situation was maybe something I wasn't alert to. It turns out that Scarcella, in sitting down with us, he was very open, and he started to describe his past. So this is a guy, now you have to mention, this is the most infamous cop in recent New York history, certainly the most infamous detective. He's cost the city, the state, $110 million in settlements so far, and that is easily going to reach 150 million, way beyond any previous record. He's called in the headlines the disgraced detective. And he comes to me to try to redeem his name. And so he tells me his stories from Bensonhurst, Brooklyn, an Italian neighborhood where some percentage of guys go into civil service, cops, firefighters, and some percentage go into the mob. And Louis starts talking quite openly about how his family had both. His dad was a cop detective, and his uncle, his adored uncle, who was also his godfather, was a captain in the Colombo crime family. So he's like a fascinating combination right from the start. And here's a little story that you get in, let's see, episode 2 of The Burden. Scarcella, Detective Scarcella, is assigned to investigate his uncle for murder. So there's a dead kid, happened to be a drug dealer, in the neighborhood, and his uncle is the chief suspect. And for whatever reason, Scarcella is assigned to investigate it. Now, his superiors certainly knew, even though you'd think that Scarcella might recuse himself. He goes and investigates. Now, there's a guy who'd have a reputation for getting lots of hard to get confessions, but he talks to his uncle. His uncle doesn't confess. His uncle says the kid deserved to die. Now, the story that emerges is that the dead guy was a drug dealer who hooked the uncle's kid on drugs, so he deserved to die. Scarcella can't find the murderer. It's an unsolved case, except I talked to him, and again, Scarcella is very open, maybe in ways that are kind of not the best for his own reputation, but he'll say, yeah, my uncle was a murderer. He gets to admit that. Yeah, he was a murderer, but he was the most honorable man I ever met. And then we're sitting at the diner one day, the diner where he used to go with his uncle, and he says to me, what would you do if somebody hooked your kid on drugs? And I looked at him and I said, I would want to kill him, but it's not in my blood. And Scarcella said, I think I would kill him and turn myself in. And then he says, this is what we call a public service murder. I'd never heard that term before. It is a little shocking to hear that term, a public service murder. You know, by a little odd to hear that from a cop. But let me stop there, and you tell me what else you're interested in, because I can go on and on and on. I mean, The Burden has 10 episodes, and each episode really focuses on a different chapter, not just of Scarcella's life. Scarcella is kind of episode 2. Episode 3 is about the jailhouse law firm, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that in a minute. But go ahead, Morgan. What's piquing your interest?
Well, public service murder, first of all, that's a really interesting term, and I wonder how often it's been thrown around. I mean, you know, I wonder if that's a common parlance among the police there. So I'm wondering about his interrogative techniques, because I know there is a history, not just in the NYPD, but I've heard about this happening in other parts of the United States and the world, where the suspect answers questions sometimes for hours, like 12 hours, and it becomes clear it's not about telling the truth. It's about saying what the detectives want to hear. They want the confession because that looks good on your resume. I would assume most police have too much integrity to do that, but there is this one famous case, this man, Otis Toole, serial killer, had a double-digit IQ, and so they just kept pressuring him to confess to all these murders, and I've always believed he didn't commit most of them. He's famously linked to the murder of Adam Walsh, the son of Mr. Walsh, who hosted America's Most Wanted. So, was this something that he did in his interrogations? Did he intimidate witnesses and suspects into confessions, or what did he do?
So I think the place to start with that is Scarcella has effectively a 9th grade education. As he says, he was socially promoted because he was a good baseball player. So here's a guy with a 9th grade education, can't do math, beaten by the nuns. He went to Catholic school because of that, beaten brutally, by the way, as an elementary school kid. Becomes a cop, and on the strength of what he considers his superpower, he becomes a successful detective. Now, that superpower is he's able to read people. He has what once described as a crystal ball in his gut. He can tell when somebody's speaking the truth or not. And he said to me, he's infallible. I've never been wrong on the job, he said. Well, I can tell you that's manifestly wrong, because it was easy enough to find people, cops, colleagues, who said, oh, no, he got this one wrong. I had it right. But put that aside for a minute. You got a guy filled with that kind of belief, right? This is an era, 80s and 90s. There weren't a lot of closed circuit TVs. There wasn't a lot of DNA evidence. You know, forensics were quite minimal at the time. This was not CSI. So it's a lot getting suspect into a room for hours and hours and staring him down. And you are allowed to lie to a suspect. So, you know, you tell them a whole bunch of things, and you're certainly allowed to accuse them of things based on witness testimony. I'm going to take a little byway here and tell you one of the things that he had going for him was that he had this go-to witness, a woman named Teresa Gomez, who was a crack addict and a sex worker and living in an extremely high crime area. She became his friend and his go-to witness. And at first it came out that she had been a witness to 6 murders in 6 cold cases that he eventually solved based on her eyewitness testimony. She was the lone witness in these cases. Fast forward 20 years, the district attorney's conviction review unit goes in, reviews these cases, reviews her testimony, and says, no one in their right mind should believe this woman. She, you know, can't keep straight the year she got married. She's just not credible. And they start overturning the cases she testified in. So they had her on the record as being a witness in 6 cases. But Detective Scarcella tells me, I believed every word she said. I think she was a truthful witness. And guess what? She saw 11 murders. Now, one person seeing 11 murders, even a crack addict living in a crack-infested neighborhood, you know, as someone said to me, the only way you could see that many murders is if you committed them. Yeah. Now, it was a really high crime area, and, you know, crack addicts were kind of treated as non-entities. So you can definitely see a lot, but that's a really hard number to grapple with, especially when her credibility was low. I will say that, and this is interesting, because Scarcella has been held up as the guy who took this one essentially incredible woman and turned her into his lead witness. And he says this to his credit, she says, she propelled his career. He makes first grade detective the highest rank a detective can get on the strength of her helping him close cases. So, you know, he doesn't have a real motivation to look at her credibility. On the other hand, the conviction review unit looks at the situation, says she's totally not believable. But guess what? Everybody in the district attorney's office knew that. You know, it wasn't really just Scarcella. It wasn't the Louis Scarcella show. Every DA who tried a case with her knew that, and it was their decision to put him on the stand. So now back to the question of what happened in those confession rooms, those interrogation rooms. Listen, you've got people whose convictions have been overturned who talk about him hitting them. And you have people who talk about how he fed them a story. People who talk about how he would wear you down over a period of hours because he talked and talked. And we looked very closely, not at every case, because obviously 21 cases is too much, but we looked really closely at the case of a guy named Shabaka Shakur. Shabak Shakur was one of the members of the jailhouse law firm, a very important member. And in his case, he was convicted of a double homicide, which he always claimed he didn't commit. But he was a previous felon. He was a drug dealer and an armed robber. And, you know, this was the time when there were 2,500 murders a year. The New York City was sick of it. You know, put him away and let God sort it out. You know, so juries believe cops without question. They believe prosecutors without question. And I think cops went with the idea that this guy's a bad guy. He fits the profile. We have a witness who now says, even if he didn't start by saying it, he now says, oh yeah, I saw him commit the murder. Now, the problem with Shabaka's case, and the reason Scarcella is deeply involved, is because the real key evidence, and we get to this in, I think it's episode 6, which is coming out in 2 weeks, episode 6 of The Burden. But we get to the real evidence against him, which I think is the crucial evidence because it provides motivation. Scarcella, Shabaka Shakur is with several other detectives. And he says, I didn't do it. And here's the phone numbers of my alibi witnesses, call them, right? And then Scarcella gets him alone for about 20 minutes and walks out with not exactly a confession, but an extremely incriminating statement, which interestingly will sound a lot like a statement we've heard before from his uncle. Shabaka, according to Scarcella, says they deserve to die, the two people. They were bad guys. They were drug dealers. They deserve to die. So Scarcella testifies to that at the trial. And none of Shabaka's alibi witnesses are called. That's defense attorneys or another podcast. And Shabaka's convicted. 20 years later, Shabaka is a jailhouse lawyer and one of the leaders of this jailhouse law firm. And these guys put their heads together. You got to imagine these are like the most oppressed, least privileged people in America. I mean, these are convicted murderers doing life in prison, not a high school degree among them. And they're sitting in the law library with old law books, teaching themselves this really arcane information about the law, coming up with arguments, jousting with the appeals division of the Brooklyn District Attorney's Office, which has 500 lawyers, right? So basically you got 3 guys who sit there and suddenly they look at each other and they realize, wait, Scarcella was a detective in your case. He was in mine. He was in mine. So now they got 3 guys. And now what Shabaka does is he puts together a brief, a motion that charges that Scarcella had a practice and pattern of corrupt practices. So it's not just him, it's a whole bunch of people. And that becomes an important legal concept that will go forward and gain momentum and something that can be used against him. So in the specific case of Shabaka, what happens, he wins a hearing based on that motion and that claim that Scarcella, he had a great phrase. Scarcella's work should not be considered pristine. That was the word he used. And a judge accepts it and says, let's have a hearing on it. And the hearing is to determine whether his conviction should be overturned. And now the focus of this hearing becomes, wait a second, Shabaka did not admit it to these other guys. But wait, Scarcella's in there for 20 minutes and Shabaka kind of gives it up? There's no witness. There's no signed statement. The notes that Scarcella says he took have gone missing. There's a detective's report that he made, but there's no backup to it. There's no videotape, which is another thing. So you have no proof accept Scarcella's word that Shabaka says anything incriminating. And so Shabaka, of course, denies it. Shabaka, in fact, tells the story in the burden that he didn't even know there was an incriminating statement until his lawyer told him so, months and months after he was arrested. Long story short, it's up to the judge to decide the credibility of Louis Scarcella, which has become the key to all these cases going forward. And you're going to have to listen to episode 6 to find out what happens.
There's one interrogative technique I'm aware of, and I wonder if he used it. It's called the read technique, where basically you act like you know the suspect is guilty, you say. So yeah, you know, when you went to this place and you killed him, this or that. Did he use that technique to try to trick anyone into confessing?
Oh yeah, he used that a lot. I mean, again, that's legal, and detectives do that all the time. They claim they have more evidence than they have. But the other guy we focus on is really the intellectual leader of the jailhouse law firm, a guy named Derek Hamilton. And he turns himself into a legal scholar. And I remember he said, "I love the law. I had to. It was my only way to freedom." And he spent 20 years trying to get his conviction overturned, motion after motion. I mean, this is a guy, you know, you got to imagine that in a jail, an inmate is powerless. That's like the nature of the system, right? And then Derek finds out he has this power. He can file motions, he can protest, he can file grievances, right? So suddenly he's filing a grievance that the water is black. He's filing a grievance that the food is no good. I mean, he got caught with the photo of a topless woman in his cell. No, he got caught taking a photo of a topless woman in a visiting room. And I mean, a woman who was his visitor and showing her breasts. And he got a discipline ticket for that. And he protested it and goes on and on saying, well, look, I'm looking at the manual. There's no place where it says I'm not allowed to take a photo of a topless woman. So Derek was really a thorn in the side. But really, his power that he acquires, and that's like warm up, those kinds of things, is that he files motion after motion. And in fact, he gets a law overturned in the state of New York. And that law, or that it was actually precedent, but the precedent was that there's a final determination. The law wants finality. You have to stop appealing after a certain time. So all these guys run out of appeals, and Derek's motion establishes a new precedent, which basically says that if somebody can make a credible claim of actual innocence, their appeal cannot be barred on technicalities. Like the deadline, you can't say the deadline is passed. You can't say they filed the wrong motion. You must hear the evidence. And that's what happens. And Derek files a motion, and he will get a hearing. And one of the things that he's always claimed, and we spent a lot of time with Derek, he's an impressive figure, a powerful man. One of the things he will claim is that Scarcella arrested him and brought him to the precinct and lied and said he had 5 witnesses who saw him do the murder. And Derek will say, I knew that wasn't true. He couldn't have 1 witness who saw me do that murder. But, you know, a lot of guys will succumb to the pressure. And I'll tell you one other thing, which is that cops in general, detectives in general, have a real advantage in what's called the felony murder law. You're probably familiar with this, Morgan, but in New York State, it's a law that says if you were committing a crime and a murder happened in the commission of that crime, even though you didn't commit the murder, even though you didn't go to, say, rob the store with the intent of committing any violence, you're guilty. You're guilty of murder. So basically, all a detective has to do is to get you to say, I was there at the scene of the crime as a participating member in some kind of vague conspiracy. If you were there, you can go down on felony murder, which is treated the same as actually killing somebody. So you'll see in a number of cases that Scarcella's suspects admit, I was there. Now, maybe they were there. I'm sure they were there in some cases. Listen, let's stipulate Scarcella put a lot of bad guys away, right? He did hundreds of cases. But there were cases where a detective knows that it's easier to get somebody to kind of give you a little something. You got to give me something. You got to hear, I'm here to help you. You got to work with me. Were you there? Okay, I was there. And you think that's innocuous. You think that's not going to amount to anything. The truth is, once you've said those 3 words, I was there, you're done. That's it. And that's a fairly low bar to cross. So you'll see some of that in Scarcella's cases as well.
Okay. And so how much weight can what the jailhouse lawyers did, how much weight does that have in the system? As a citizen, obviously, you're not an officer of the court like a lawyer. So, yeah, I'm not that familiar with the American legal system. So, yeah, how much weight does that carry, what they did?
Oh, it carried a ton of weight. It changed everything. Derek's lawsuit that established the rule of actual innocence, that if you could make a credible claim of actual innocence, you could get back into court, changed everything. Because now these jailhouse lawyers whose appeals have expired, they don't have any way to even get into court at that point. Now they've got a way to get into court because all they have to do is make a credible claim. They don't have to prove it. They don't have to prove they're innocent. They have to just make a claim that seems reasonable and persuasive to a standard that's not terrifically high. And then they can get into court. And once they get into court, they don't actually have to prove actual innocence. They can prove that the evidence was wrong, that their defense attorney was incompetent. They can attack the credibility of Scarcella. And one of the things that you find happening, and it's really as a result of the efforts of this jailhouse law firm. I mean, it's an incredible story, imagine, spending time in prison, 20 years in prison, and day after day, these guys don't have access to the outside. We got a hold of a lot of phone calls that Shabaka made from prison because, they're conducting their lives, outside lives, over payphones. And they're running their legal cases over payphones. So we got a hold of a lot of these recordings, and you get a sense of the cleverness and the despair that becomes part of their lives, and the persistence and determination as well. So Derek's case absolutely changes the law, provides a way into court, and as the cases against Scarcella start to mount, one of the precedents that emerges is Scarcella is now considered a corrupt cop, or let's say a cop whose word cannot be trusted. So suddenly, if you can prove that Scarcella had an important consequential role in your case, you have a really good shot at getting your case overturned. Now, this all starts with Shabaka putting together this pattern and practice. And then as people have their convictions overturned, and it's a little circular, as they have their convictions overturned, Well, now it looks like anything Scarcella touches is questionable. And defendants have actually, I mean, you'd have to say guilty people have had their convictions overturned because Scarcella had an active role in a case. Now, I say guilty because, interestingly, the judge overturned the conviction, saying, well, Scarcella's in the case and we know he's a bad guy, a rotten cop. So I'm overturning this conviction. So now that means it's up to the district attorney. The conviction goes away, but the district attorney can say, I want to try him again. Okay, he gets a new trial, fine. I'm going to put him back on the at the defense table, and I'm going to prove that he's guilty again. So the judge overturns the conviction. The case now comes from retrial before the same judge, no jury, same judge, and she finds him guilty. So it's kind of fascinating. He had this conviction overturned, but in fact, she determined that he was guilty. So there's a difference, and it's not often recognized, but there's a real difference worth keeping in mind between somebody who has a conviction overturned and somebody who's innocent, because that's not the same thing. And you know what's really important here is that you can be wrongfully convicted even when you're guilty, right? But I think people, I mean citizens, voters, you and me need to make a decision. How do we feel about that? Can you wrongfully convict somebody? Can you kind of put your foot on the pedal or your thumb on the scale and say, oh, this guy should go away because you believe it, because he did something else, because he's a bad guy? I mean, if that's the case, then you see what happens. But if that's not the case, if we want the justice system to not cheat, then we have to say a conviction must be an honest, solid conviction, right? That doesn't mean the guy's innocent, and you'll see that in almost all of these cases where convictions are overturned, there's a detail or a line that says, we don't know if he's innocent or guilty, but we do know he should not have been convicted on the evidence presented.
And Scintilla, he, at the risk of spoiling the story for the listeners, so was he fired or did he resign? How did that come about? Is the end of his career in law enforcement?
No, well, what's really interesting is that he retired. He retired in the year 2000, and these charges did not emerge until 2013. And so it's really for the past decade that he's been under fire. But, you know, I do want to say one thing to your listeners, and Dax and I think we both agree, and we come from different perspectives, but I think that enriched the show. You know, New York was a city that was seeming like a failed experiment at a certain time. You know, there was poverty, there was crack, violence. People were afraid, you know, somebody told me, you know, cars were afraid to stop at traffic lights for fear they would be hijacked. That may be an exaggeration, but there was a real fear in the city. And so the voters said to the politicians, do something. There's a famous headline in the New York Post, Dave, do something. And Dave was David Dinkins, the mayor of New York.
Oh, I thought you were going to mention Ford to City, drop dead.
Yeah, that was a great headline too. Yeah, Dave, do something. So David Dinkins, the first African-American mayor in New York history, comes in full of promises to increase social programs and spend more money improving the standard of living, is immediately faced with a different kind of crisis. And he says, I am willing to do whatever is necessary to make sure the streets are safe by day and by night. And what does he do? He hires 1,000 new cops. So the cops are like empowered, you know, it's a crisis. The city's out of control. You guys go take control. And the truth is, you know, you and me, the citizens, we voted for Dinkins, and then we voted for Giuliani, who really was the champion of that method, Mayor Giuliani. And we didn't really want to know what they were doing, how they were doing it. We just really wanted the problem handled. And the cops will tell you, guess what? We handled the problem. You know, we made your crappy neighborhood safe for your dog runs and your sushi bars. And, you know, now you want to come and point fingers at us and blame us? You know, it was a war on crime. Yeah, a war on crime. Every war has collateral damage. And, you know, I mean, there's something to that argument, but I think it really kind of falls back on the voters, you and me. I mean, New York's mayor now is Eric Adams. He's an ex-cop. And right at the end of the race, when it was tightening, he came out and he said, we need to be tough on crime. The murder rate was climbing. You know, we were experiencing a rise in violence, nothing like it was in the early 90s. But people were, again, afraid. And Eric Adams comes out and says, leave it to me, I'm going to handle it. And I believe that pushed him to victory. So, you know, we're constantly faced with this situation. And I don't like the idea. Listen, I don't, Scarcella's police work was hardly pristine. You know, like as if that's a big surprise from a guy who says, oh, I was never wrong. My gut was always right. A guy who had a 9th grade education. But we also had a part in it, you know, you and me. We told the politicians what we wanted. And they unleashed. They told the cops, go in and solve the problem. And you know who walked forward? Thrilled about it? Detective Louis Scarcella. He told me, the people needed me, and I loved doing it.
Well, you know, when he was trained, I don't know when that would have been. Do you know?
He would have been trained in the 70s.
Yeah, so nowadays, if you're going to become a police officer, you have to take police sciences courses in college. And so I think maybe there's a lot more academic background to it now. But when he started, there probably wasn't as much of that, right? I think it was probably more brass tacks stuff. But yeah, he probably learned the administrative side of it, but maybe there wasn't as much of understanding how things break down in terms of economic issues in these high crime areas. So he probably didn't study a lot of that, right?
I'm sure he did not. I mean, he went to the police academy, but here in his training is what I think is really significant. There was no training to be a detective. You were promoted to detective, and you kind of were supposed to learn it from your peers, and you kind of were supposed to have a street sense and be able to kind of gauge what was going on. And, you know, listen, let's face it, Scarcella is an Italian cop, and maybe he does have a street sense for, you know, what people in his old neighborhood mean when they say one thing. Do they mean what they say, or do they wink, wink mean something else? But then he's going into a neighborhood that's one of, like, say, a public housing project, which was very much, sadly, centers for crack addiction and drug dealing. Does Detective Louis Scarcella understand? Can he have a sense? Can he read that culture in the same way? I mean, it's hard to believe he could, but one of the things Scarcella had was extreme confidence in his own abilities.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned that your co-host is an African-American gentleman, and I know that the African-American population has had an an uneasy relationship with the police. That's something that's been ongoing for a very long time. So are all these issues very emotional for him? How does he respond to it all?
Well, that's a good question, and obviously I should let him speak for himself. But in the podcasts, in the burden, he does, and I will tell you that one of the things, because he and I really got to know each other and got to be friends. It took us 3 years to do this podcast, so we were really on a journey together. And one of the things that I found really moving and troubling was something I mentioned a little earlier, but he told me the story of how, now he's a lawyer in addition to being a journalist. So he's in law school at George Washington University. He's with a buddy from law school, another black man, and they're doing pull-ups on a scaffolding, one of those scaffoldings at a construction site. And these cops pull up and it's get down on your knees. What? These are law students, and they just did a push-up. And Dax, my co-host, saying, I didn't do anything. I'm not getting down on my knees. So the cops start swinging, and he's arrested because this is what cops do. He's arrested for resisting arrest, even though he's the one with the bruises on it. So Dax comes with a very kind of different perspective than I do. We kind of stated at the beginning of the podcast, I wanted to understand Scarcella, and he wanted to know more about the victims. Now, it wasn't nearly that stark and that defined as we went through. He very much got into Scarcella and came to his own opinions. And I was certainly very involved with the victims in the jailhouse law firm. But Dax had a kind of reckoning, and you guys get to episode 10, you're going to hear it, and I'm not going to tell you what happened, but one of the really interesting things in the Burden's final episode is Derek Hamilton, who's the head of the jailhouse law firm, and Detective Louis Scarcella, who's the cop who put Derek away and helped wrongfully convict Derek. They hate each other. Sometimes in the past, Derek has wanted him dead. Scarcella has sometimes said he killed more people than smallpox. So they've been feuding at a distance through the press, through TV. And we arranged for them to get together and talk. They were on a Zoom call together for about 20 minutes. And it's pretty fascinating what comes out of that. And I'm not going to tell you what it is, but I think that in terms of a crescendo of this, jailhouse law firm that's fighting for oxygen, as the water level's rising, and Scarcella, who's kind of standing on the mountaintop as the water's rising. You have these two forces that come together in a really fascinating way at the end of this podcast.
Mm-hmm. And if you're a public defender representing men like the ones who went on to form that jailhouse law firm, in this case, considering what they were up against, these public defenders, did they stand a chance? Like how did they come up against this?
Well, they had public defenders. They also have what's called in New York 18B lawyers. So those are lawyers who are in private practice, who are appointed by the court. Often they're lawyers who don't have a lot of business, and they get paid a lower rate, but it's still a good living. And so Derek had an 18B lawyer for a previous case, who was a very good lawyer, go on to be a legal aid lawyer. She fought hard. She got the evidence out. A jury's not inclined to believe a guy like Derek, and he didn't take the stand, but not inclined to believe a defendant. And I think that might have been the major hurdle, though I will say in Shabaka's case, the defense attorney was probably incompetent. I mean, again, a private lawyer recruited to do this, but you know, lawyers get old, and the lawyers who end up doing the 18B work are less experienced. They're looking for a way to make a few dollars. And this guy, for instance, did not call Shabaka's alibi witnesses. So what I'm saying is, you know, the legal aid lawyers are incredibly dedicated. They're overwhelmed by the number of cases. The pressure on them to plead the cases is enormous, right? Rather than go to trial. At the same time, kind of what becomes amazing is that Derek Hamilton, once he gets out of prison, he goes from a jailhouse lawyer to a legit legal force. I love it. I saw that the new Apple, I don't know, iOS 17 is maybe taking it off, but his voice message used to be, "You've reached Derek Hamilton, paralegal, legal extraordinaire." Their message. But it was kind of right. So he becomes a paralegal. You know, he doesn't want to go to law school because, you know, he knows the law already, but he becomes paralegal, and he becomes the kind of head of a movement to free other people who have been wrongfully convicted. I mean, it's a movement now, right? And Derek, now this is a crazy story. I mean, Derek was on his way to an early death on the streets. You know, he grew up, and I mean, he shot people. There's no doubt about it. He was carrying a gun. He was shot at. Derek's life expectancy was not long, but he becomes this really elite jailhouse lawyer, finally recognized by being appointed deputy director of a wrongful conviction clinic at a New York City law school. I mean,
yeah.
It's an astounding trajectory for somebody like him.
Did any of them take plea deals when they were when their trials were underway? You know, when they were still represented by other lawyers?
Well, no, none of the guys that we looked at, and I don't think any of the guys, any of those 21 people who were wrongfully convicted did, which is another tell. I mean, somebody who's guilty will most often take a plea. I mean, it's a huge risk, as your listeners probably know, it's a huge risk to turn down a plea and go to trial because your sentence is just going to be longer.
Yeah.
If you make the state go to trial, spend all those resources and money and time, the state's going to take revenge by going for a stiffer sentence. So none of these guys do. They go up and they say, "I'm innocent, I'm going to prove it." Some of them are quite naive about the system.
Another risky option too is the Alford plea. Were any of them tempted to go that route, or?
Derek took an Alford plea for a previous case, but no, none of them took the Alford plea. I will say that one of the guys, if you remember Teresa Gomez, the witness who was the crack addict, Scarcella's go-to witness, she is brought in to testify against a defendant, and the defendant decides to plead guilty and take a lesser sentence. Now, one interpretation, Scarcella's interpretation, is that he knew that Teresa Gomez was going to put him in prison because she saw the crime. What he does is he tries to withdraw his guilty plea. He feels like he was pressured into it by his attorney. The judge won't accept his withdrawal. So he's stuck with this guilty plea, and he will go to prison and spend years trying to withdraw his guilty plea and prove that he was pressured into it. So this is an example of the plea and the way it's used to get somebody who may, I mean, we don't know in his case, who may be wrongfully convicted.
Yeah, I think this case would would make a great biopic or documentary. Because there's the whole thing of people really working overtime for years trying to make this happen, and triumph of the human spirit type of thing. It's
Mm.
like a Ron Howard movie waiting to happen.
I think so. I mean, the Jailhouse Law Firm is just an incredible story. It's just incredible. And, I mean, and they're like this band of brothers, because one of them gets out and then he goes back. He makes a promise to one of them. He says, I'm going to come for you. Don't worry, I'm going to come for you. And he does. And they get a new trial, a new hearing. I'm not going to tell you what happens in The Burden, but don't miss episode 8, because that thing goes off the rails in the most bizarre way you can imagine.
Do you think, the United States is kind of infamous now for having the highest rate of incarceration in the world? And when you consider the creation of laws like RICO and the law you mentioned earlier about how if you're committing a crime and a murder happens accidentally, you're still charged for it, and mandatory minimums, do you think the United States government aims toward putting more and more people in prison and keeping them there?
Well, yeah, I mean, look at the numbers. It's just crazy. And you wonder how other countries do it, but maybe the question is ask, how does the United States do it? I mean, we're an extremely punitive society, and we don't want to accept any notion that rehabilitation is possible. I mean, I do think sometimes that it's worth looking at the victim's point of view and the point of view of the victim's family. I don't know. I've managed to put myself in that mind frame sometimes, and I understand it. But that's, that is the position that the politicians have run with, an eye for an eye. They're Old Testament folk. They're not turn the other cheek folk. They're not people who root. And, they all also, as a reflex, say, put them away. And I think the other thing that's very disturbing is that there's a desire not only to be punitive by putting people in jail, but to make the jail experience worse and worse. So for instance, they've abolished or virtually abolished educational opportunities in prison. Now, why would you do that? I mean, people are going to come out of prison and you want them to integrate, don't you? And so you're going to deprive them of educational opportunities? I mean, whatever your feelings are about just sentencing, once somebody's in prison, you really ought to want them to be able to better themselves and work toward becoming a member of society.
Yeah, there's this. I had a prison pen pal briefly, and so she was involved with this crime where her boyfriend wanted to rob somebody. So what they did was she lured a man she met online to this location, and so she lured a man to this location, and her boyfriend went to rob him, but ended up killing him. And because she was involved in the crime, she got life in prison, not just a standard murder sentence, but she's going to die there. And I mean, I've always felt like that was extreme. Do you think that's too much? Or?
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly the felony murder statute that we spoke about. Yeah, I would like to know more of the history of that. I mean, it makes me think of these laws that went into effect. I think it was in the 80s in New York State. The laws that allowed children to be tried as adults. It became a huge issue. You did have teenagers committing these violent crimes, certainly, but they became big headlines, and there was this uproar, and again the politicians jumped on it, on the emotion, and fueled it. And so suddenly you found that, I think it was kids as young as 11, I may be wrong about the 11, but it's certainly younger teenagers were now being tried as adults. And so you see all kinds of crazy I mean, look at the drug laws, like, I mean, now, marijuana is in New York State, it's a ticket, and they don't even prosecute it.
Yeah.
And people went to prison for dozens of years for possession of marijuana. It's, the sentencing is its own kind of victimization.
Oh, ludicrous.
Victimizing.
Well, on that note, I'm going to thank you very much for joining us today. So everybody, listen to the Burden podcast. So the first few episodes have debuted already. So
yeah, the first few episodes are up. So please, on Apple Podcasts, it's called The Burden. It's a fantastic show. And obviously listen wherever you get your podcasts. And I would love to hear your feedback. We've got a subscription channel if you want to hear bonus episodes and get early listens as well.
Yeah, it's a very well polished show. It's like FM radio quality. It's very well put together.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much for joining us today, Steve.
Thank you, Morgan.
Have a good day.